it is really a pleasure to be able to introduce Jordan Rosenblum, who is the Belzer Professor of Classical Judaism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also serves as the Director of Religious Studies. Before coming to Madison, he was a Starr postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, and among other things, he is the author of The Jewish Dietary Laws in the Ancient World, which came out in 2016 with Cambridge University Press, and Food and Identity in Early Rabbinic Judaism that appeared in 2014. His research focuses on the literature, law, and social history of the rabbinic movement in general, and in particular, and this is what we'll be hearing about tonight, on rabbinic food regulations. He's interested in food studies, animal studies, and a number of other topics as well. I've also just learned that he plays 3 instruments in a band with some friends and colleagues in Madison. But it has led him to research the fascinating story, for instance, of Jews and Chinese food, pork in the discourse by and about Jews from antiquity to modernity, kosher olive oil in antiquity, and the connection between cookbooks and identity formation. And we had a lively discussion just now at dinner about the big new thing of kosher bacon. Some of you might have read about that in the Times this past week. Tomorrow, I should also add, he's giving a talk on campus that is entitled Dolphins, Apes, and Donkeys, Animals and Legal Categories in Rabbinic Literature, and everyone is welcome, 11:30 with a lunch served in Nicholson Hall. So his talk tonight is entitled Rabbinic Drinking, Learning Themes in Rabbinic Literature Through the Drinking Glass. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rosen.
So a few things. Is this loud enough in the back? Okay, I will try and also have this. A few things. First, I wanted to thank Marielle, Tom Leslie for inviting me. I really appreciate it. As someone who works at a large state university in the next state, I really appreciate the importance of having a vibrant Center for Jewish Studies at a flagship state university, and I'm really happy to get a chance to interact with some of my colleagues here. I'm going to, 2 things is I want to just situate this project quickly, which is this comes out of a book that I'm working on, which is designed for Introduction to Rabbinic Literature classes, and it's looking at ways to introduce key themes in rabbinic literature through rabbinic texts about drinks and drinking. So I'm going to open with a little introduction to the rabbis. I'm not going to assume any knowledge on that. And I'm going to give you a few examples, but these are just a few of the many. So if you have want to ask me more general questions, I'm happy to, but I also I could talk for days, and that was not encouraged. Also, because like the rabbis, I sometimes go off on tangents, I've written my talk to keep me on schedule. But I've written in jokes, so don't worry, I'll stop if you don't laugh and tell you it's a joke so you know to laugh. So if you want to save time, just assume it's a joke. Okay. The religion of the Hebrew Bible is one of sacrifice. Priests offer animals, grains, and wine on a physical altar to a deity. Therefore, when in 70 CE, the Romans destroy the central cultic location, the temple in Jerusalem, a chaotic and dire situation unfolds with far-reaching religious, economic, social, and political consequences. If this moment were a movie trailer, the screen would depict the temple in smoldering ruins, and a somber voice, which I won't try too much to pretend to be, would intone, "In a world without the temple, where many ancient Jews struggle to make sense, one small group rises from the ashes, the rabbis. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the rabbis consider themselves to reconstitute the body of Israel in order to lead the Jewish people into the future. In order to navigate this new reality, the rabbinic movement developed a tradition that God revealed 2 Torahs to Moses on Mount Sinai, the written Torah and the oral Torah. For the rabbis, the written Torah, in Hebrew, Torah Shebechtav, is an established canonical text. It is the Hebrew Bible. It is a bound text. It is the Torah. Oral Torah, in Hebrew Torah Shebe'al Peh, on the other hand, is a much more wide-ranging text. It is Torah without the definite article, without the the. It is not a bound text, but a continuous unfolding of revelation. This dual conception allows for tradition and innovation to exist side by side. For example, the written Torah might command in Exodus 35:3 that one cannot kindle a fire on the Sabbath, but it does not say whether one can fire up an Amazon Kindle in order to read a book on the Sabbath. Oral Torah allows for this process of updating. In revealing oral Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, God backed up the entirety of revelation to the cloud. Like modern cloud computing, revelation is now available for download by authorized users, that is, by rabbis, in order to retrieve stored divine knowledge and law. Moses downloaded the first file and then backed it up. And this metaphor about modern computing is not even anachronistic. Since everything was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, then cloud computing was revealed too. So one can therefore think of Oral Torah as the official name of the rabbinic cloud server. Over time, the traditions of Oral Torah were collected into a series of documents written and edited in Roman Palestine and Persian Sasanian Babylonia from the 3rd through the 7th century CE, including the Mishnah, a series of topically arranged texts that is a combination of a legal code, a textbook, and a philosophical treatise. We're actually not exactly sure what the Mishnah is or why it came to be. This is from a manuscript of the Mishnah. The Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds, which are expansive commentaries on the Mishnah and so much more, and the Midrash, which are the various exegetical commentaries on biblical texts. These texts reflect the inchoate, the unformed development of the early rabbinic movement, which over the ensuing centuries develops into the dominant form of Judaism. Modern Judaism, in all of its multiple manifestations, is rabbinic Judaism, and therefore one must understand this ancient literature in order to understand the religion that builds upon it. Or at least this is what I say to deans whenever I try and justify my position. Though these texts are fundamental to understanding the history and evolution of Judaism, they are also quite complex and daunting for the novice to read, and for those who claim to be experts, I should add. Rabbinic literature presumes tremendous prior knowledge, and its fascinating twists and turns in logic are disorienting for even those well-versed in this corpus. In order to help navigate this brilliant but bewildering terrain, this talk, which draws from that book project I mentioned, focuses on rabbinic conversations about beverages, rabbinic debates about what, when, how, and with whom one should drink, allow readers to set sail on what is often called the Sea of Talmud. Why should such an introduction focus on drinking? Well, that's what my editor asked me to write about, so I added that in. Drinking is a basic human need. After all, a human can live much longer without eating than without drinking. An essential necessity for survival, beverages are both commonly discussed and often ideologically laden. As such, they communicate key rabbinic values, such as moderation and self-restraint, ritual regulations, and gender norms, to name a few. Furthermore, focusing on a single topic not only allows for coherent discussion, but assures that given this particular topic, important lessons and issues are covered in the midst of reading fascinating texts in which the mundane intermingle with the profound. Finally, given that this book, that this talk draws on, is designed for introductory college classes, the fact that important rabbinic concepts, from interactions with non-Jews to permitted actions on holidays, are conveyed via rabbinic discussions about beer and wine, for example, makes for engaging conversation. I don't know if Minnesota undergrads are similar to Wisconsin undergrads, but drinking seems to be something they enjoy discussing. In this talk, I focus on 4 of the many topics that I will cover in this book. So I will cover more about beverages in it and more about different topics and more about these topics. So first we explore festival laws, discussing the straining of wine and brewing of beer on festival days. So we'll come back to that. Next, we learn what drinking water from a fountain teaches about idolatry. Then we learn the rules of rabbinic ritual purity that arise when your drunk friend pushes you in a river. And we conclude by learning that, like wine, learning Torah makes one's face light up. As is the case when ordering wine from a restaurant, this talk constitutes but the first small pour. I hope that you enjoy the taste and then want to drink what the rest of the bottle contains. So the first section is straining wine and brewing beer on intermediate festival days. See, am I blocking anyone's view? No, you can see? Okay, good. On festival days, which just happened, a series of special regulations apply. But what about those days sandwiched in between festival days of Passover and Sukkot? Sukkot we just passed. These intermediate festival days, or in Hebrew Chol Hamoed, occur when festival days bookend non-festival days. Coincidentally, in the modern rabbinic calendar, last week was primarily composed of intermediate festival days. Sunday, September 23rd through Tuesday were the beginning, and this past Sunday through Tuesday were the end of days of Sukkot. But the 5 days in between were non-festival days. These non-festival days are invested with some significance, making them like festival days, but also at the same time, they are like other non-sacral days. They are semi-sacred, quasi-festival, holiday-ish. Given the hybrid status of these days, the rabbis devote significant attention to spelling out what festival day regulations do and do not apply to intermediate festival days. This is a mark of the rabbis where they're interested in the anomalous, so they want to think of intermediate festival days are kind of like holidays, kind of like regular days, but not really either, and so they focus on them because they're odd. They're not interested in things that are normal. This normal saying, right, is if you hear hoofbeats, think horse, not zebras. For the rabbis, it's the opposite. If they hear hoofbeats, they want to think of zebras. They want to think of the odd case. In fact, this is the subject of an entire tractate named Moed Katan, Little Festival, which covers a variety of topics, including practical issues, such as whether it is permissible to clip fingernails and toenails on intermediate festival days. As I'm sure your rabbi has taught you, for those curious, the answer to that is indeed you can clip your fingernails and toenails on intermediate festival days, but probably keep your nail clippers away for the portion of this talk. Good. See, I didn't have to explain that was a joke. So, to what extent do festival rules apply to the intermediate days of a festival? This is especially important because if a person continues to do something on these days, they will need to know, begins to do something on these days, they need to know if they can continue doing it on the festival day that's right around the corner. One area of which this concern arises is in regard to brewing beer on an intermediate festival day. But to understand this question, this is a standard rabbinic thing, I'm going to talk about that, but so you need to know about that, I need to talk to you about 15 things first. We need to first examine Sabbath and festival laws related to straining of wine. So we're going to get to beer, we have to start with wine. To get to beer on an intermediate festival day, we have to start with wine on a Sabbath day. So according to Mishnah Shabbat 21, which is right up there, Rabbi Eliezer says one may suspend a strainer on a festival day, but not on the Sabbath. And one may put wine through a strainer on the Sabbath, and thus also on a festival day. But the sages say one may neither suspend a strainer on a festival day, nor put wine through a strainer on the Sabbath, but one may put wine through a strainer on a festival day. I'm going to keep the text up there, and I'm going to sort of walk you through the texts. There are a series of elaborate Sabbath prohibitions, which the rabbis group into 39 categories of prohibited labor in Hebrew malachot. Some of these prohibitions extend to festival days, and others do not. And some that extend to festival days also extend to intermediate festival days, and others do not. And some of those that do extend to festival days also extend to intermediate, I said that already. And so in Sabbath, Mishnah Shabbat 21, those questions come up in regard to straining wine. In the ancient Mediterranean world, as in today, though to a much lesser extent due to technology, stored wine contains sediment. So one way to separate wine from sediment is to pour the wine through a strainer, as they talk about. So such a pre-drink routine becomes potentially problematic if doing so is classified as a category of prohibited labor. Is suspending a strainer, is setting up a strainer over a drinking cup, an act of building? Does the physical act of putting wine in a strainer, of pouring it through a sieve, constitute selecting? If so, both building and selecting are categories of prohibited labor according to Mishnah Shabbat 7:2. So Rabbi Eliezer considers these questions and concludes that both placing and using a wine strainer is allowed on a festival day. However, only the latter, only using a strainer, is permitted on the Sabbath. The anonymous sages, who represent the majority of anonymous rabbinic opinion, disagree. Both acts are prohibited on the Sabbath, and only the latter, the straining, is permitted on a festival day. It would seem that wine poured on a Sabbath and on the festival day will have sediment in it. That is, unless you remember to set up your strainer prior to the beginning of a festival day. In its commentary in the Mishnah, The Babylonian Talmud adds three interesting elements. First, and here we're moving to that text, I summarize the elements in the text. It introduces the concept of a subterfuge, i.e. of using one permitted act as a pretext to allow for another action, the latter of which would have been prohibited on its own. So you can't do action 1, but if you do action 2, it allows you to do, in effect, action 1, because you didn't actually do action 1. So second, it considers the impact on beer as well, which makes sense since unlike the Roman-influenced Palestinians, Babylonians were beer drinkers. So Babylonians are a beer drinking culture, that's why they're going to ask about that. And third, it considers how this legislation affects drinking habits during intermediate festival days. So therefore we discover, and now we turn to the text on the bottom portion of that, Rabba bar Rav Huna said, one may employ a subterfuge with regard to suspending a strainer on a festival day by using it to hold pomegranates in it. And then, once it is already set up, pour wine through it and hold sediment in it. Rav Ashi says, provided that he holds pomegranates in it first. I pause the text here in order to fully appreciate Rabba bar Rav Huna's brilliant artifice. This is my favorite when the rabbis are playing wonderful tricks. Setting up a strainer through which to pour wine on a festival day, still forbidden. But remember that Mishnah Shabbat 21 allows the physical act of straining wine on a festival day. It merely prohibits setting up an apparatus to do so. This is where the pomegranates prove useful. A popular fruit, pomegranates ripen around August, making them ideal for eating on Rosh Hashanah, a holiday that just occurred, and Sukkot. Actually, the history of apples on Rosh Hashanah is a much more modern history. Pomegranates is a much older one. And there's not 613 seeds in pomegranates, but that's a whole other story. Therefore, if on a festival day I were to set up a strainer in order to hold pomegranates, which is a permitted action, I'm setting up a strainer just to hold my pomegranates, nothing else. And then, once it's set up, I would use it to filter my wine. Well, now that it's set up, I would pull out those pomegranates, filter my wine, which is another permitted action. Then I would have managed to achieve my intended goal without violating halakha, without violating normative rabbinic law. I would have sediment-free wine and have effectively worked around the prohibited action. And this is why Rav Ashi's provision is important. For this all to work, for this all to be legal, one needs to actually place pomegranates in the strainer first. Failure to do so would mean that the strainer was explicitly set up for the purpose of straining wine. That's forbidden. But if I set up the strainer and then place pomegranates in it, I would have proven that my purpose of setting up the strainer was to hold pomegranates. And once I've proven that, if I were to remove all those pomegranates and then use the strainer to catch the sediment from our wine that I pour through it, then I would now have permissible sediment-free wine on an intermediate festival day. Note, however, that the text explicitly acknowledges that this is all a subterfuge. In the equivalent of an ancient wink, it admits that this pomegranate trick is just that. It's a trick, a subtext to work around a prohibited action in order to achieve a desired and now permissible goal. Where there is a will, there is a way, especially where wine is involved. And this is another feature of rabbinic texts where they acknowledge sometimes that they're clearly being tricky. But that's part of the rabbinic game, is it's okay to be tricky as long as you're being tricky in the right way. If you're being tricky in the wrong way, you're a heretic. Right? If you're tricky in the right way, you're brilliant. Now we turn to beer. The Babylonian Talmud was composed in a cultural context in which beer is the beverage of choice, not wine, the preferred beverage in Roman Palestine. Just like, I think Minnesota works the same way as Wisconsin. I'm sure its beer culture is much more prevalent here than wine culture. Much like we would expect a text compiled in Italy to discuss coffee and wine, while one edited in England to focus on tea and ale, we should expect conversation about wine in the Babylonian Talmud to quickly pivot towards beer. And that is precisely what happens in the continuation of our text. How is this case in regard to straining wine different from that which is taught in a baraita? I'll explain that term in a second. One may brew beer on the intermediate days of the festival when it is necessary for drinking on the festival. But if it is not necessary for drinking on the festival, then brewing it is forbidden. This ruling applies to brewing both date beer and barley beer. Even though one has old beer available for festival drinking, one may employ a subterfuge and drink from the new freshly brewed beer. There, in regard to the beer subterfuge, the matter is not apparent. Here, in regard to the wine subterfuge, the matter is apparent. Okay, we begin with the question, how is the case of straining wine on an intermediate festival day different from a case involving brewing beer on such a day? To establish the similarities and differences between these two case studies, the Talmud cites a baraita, which is a tradition reputed to be of earlier rabbinic origin that is cited in a later text. So a baraita it's a later text that claims to be citing an earlier text. Sometimes we have evidence that suggests that it is, sometimes maybe they invented it, but I like to point that out because it's a claim. So when they say that, they're claiming there's an earlier, more authoritative source that they're going on. The baraita presumes that brewing beer on a festival day itself is prohibited. But what about brewing beer on an intermediate festival day? If the beer being brewed is specifically for celebration of a fast approaching festival day, then go ahead and brew it. But if the beer is being brewed for use on a regular day, sometime after the festival is concluded, then the act of brewing is prohibited. In this way, the connection between the intermediate festival day and the festival day itself is made explicit. Actions on these semi-sacred days should be weighed in relevance to the surrounding festival days. So beer brewed for use on a festival day is allowed, but an act of brewing that constitutes preparation for time beyond festival time detracts from the holiness of this time and is forbidden. You're thinking ahead, you're not supposed to be. This ruling applies to two different types of beer brewed from dates and beer brewed from barley. This is important because of their relevance to the two holidays that actually have intermediate festival days, Passover and Sukkot. On Passover, there's a picture of barley. Barley is one of the 5 species that fall under the category of leaven, in Hebrew chametz, and thus cannot be combined with water and consumed on a festival. Barley beer would therefore be impermissible throughout the entirety of Passover, whether on a festival day or an intermediate festival day. So you can't brew this for that day, it's all forbidden. But date beer would be kosher for Passover. In fact, with the rise of gluten intolerance and people avoiding gluten, date beer has become a sort of microbrew industry, and there's some crossover with kosher for Passover populations. On Sukkot, when leaven is not prohibited, barley beer would not be of a concern, and neither would date beer. But, I'm sure you all remember, date beer actually has an added benefit for the celebration of Sukkot. The date palm is one of the 4 species, pictured there, that play a key role in the ritual celebration of Sukkot. The date palm frond, or in Hebrew, the lulav, along with other members of the 4 species, myrtle, willow, and citron, in Hebrew, hadas, arva, and etrog, is used in an elaborate performative ritual in the Rabbinic Sukkot liturgy. While this might not have been at the forefront of their minds, drinking date beer on Sukkot certainly accords with the general spirit of this particular festival. Next, I'm just returning back to that text without those pictures. Next, we return to the concept of subterfuge. In this case, even though there's old beer on hand, one may brew new beer on an intermediate festival day and then imbibe that fresh beer on the festival day itself. So what do we learn from this new evidence? If beer is an important part of my festival celebration, and I have either none or an insufficient supply, I may brew more beer on an intermediate festival day for the festival. But what if I have an ample supply of beer? According to this baraita, I may still not brew new beer. I may still brew new beer and consume that beer on the festival day, and my supply of old beer can then be used for drinking for time beyond that non-festival time. Therefore, regardless of my actual necessity for festival brewing, I may claim that I need it, and that claim can function as a legal fiction for brewing beer on intermediate festival days. However, in the last line of this passage, the anonymous voice of the Talmud correctly asserts that the beer subterfuge is not quite the same as the previous one, employed for straining wine. In the case of the beer subterfuge, brewing beer on an intermediate festival day for consumption on a festival day is allowed. Further, not only is the actual act itself permitted, but there's no way for the casual observer to know how much beer any given brewer has stored up for use on or after the festival. But in the case of the wine subterfuge, if you're going to straining wine in an intermediate festival day is allowed, but setting up the strainer itself is not. Therefore, the casual observer can witness a person suspending a wine strainer without first putting pomegranates in it. Then they would know that the presumption would be that that person set the strainer up only for straining wine, and that doing so they violated rabbinic law. The matter would be apparent and visible, And so therefore a subterfuge, a visible subterfuge must be employed. So that's why you need those pomegranates. As such, these cases are roughly comparable, but with an important caveat, because in the case of brewing beer, no visible action is needed. Like the hole in the middle of a donut, that's my big, wonderful graphic, it's a hole in the middle of a donut, in case you didn't know. Intermediate festival days are an absence in the middle of a substance. And yet what might seem like blank space both defines and is defined by that which surrounds it. Beverage-related rabbinic law, therefore, can be used to exemplify the various issues raised by the semi-sacred days that intermediate festival days represent. And it is not just the intermediate festival days themselves which makes these days such fascinating case studies for halakha, because along the way, we encounter the concept of subterfuge and other concepts. So here, we see the rabbis trying to figure out a legal loophole that allows for illicit drinking without violating rabbinic law. Were these texts to be created today, they almost certainly would employ our present language of communication, which my students use in their emails to me, namely emoticons. The wine and beer subterfuge would therefore be accompanied by a winking face, to the hint, the witty playfulness of these claims, and perhaps the text would end with the comment, ROTFL, rabbi on the floor laughing. The next section is drinking from a statue and kissing an idol. While worshiping the one singular Jewish God on festival, intermediate festival, Sabbath, and ordinary days is a central rabbinic practice, the rabbis also expend significant energy considering the polar opposite practice, namely idolatry, referred to in Hebrew as avodah zarah, literally meaning foreign worship. The rabbis devote an entire tractate, named avodah zarah, to studying the inversion of proper rabbinic ritual. Fundamentally, the rabbis understand idolatry as a practice that symbolically inverts normative, legal, rabbinic practice. Because at its very core, idolatry presumes the authority and reverence of a deity or deities beside the singular God of the rabbis. So for them, the very action of idolatry is the polar opposite because it presumes the presence of a deity other than the one rabbinic God. So further, the rabbis understand idolatry in general as requiring action, not just belief, and unambiguously cultic action at that. So for example, we are taught that one who engages in idolatry, whether he worships an idol in the manner it is normally worshipped, or sacrifices, or burns incense, or pours a libation, or bows, or accepts it as a god saying, "You are my God." These are unambiguous. For instance, I don't think it gets any clearer than a person saying, "You, idol, are my God." That's idolatry, right? I think we can all agree that person's an idolater. But Mishnah Sanhedrin 7:6 continues on to detail other actions directed towards the idol that are not quite unambiguous worship, such as hugging or kissing an idol, and thus which have negative consequences, such as flogging, but not the full consequence for idolatry, which involves being stoned to death. For the latter, for the stoning, one must actually worship an idol in the manner that an idol is worshipped. Only then, by this unambiguous action, is the person declared an idolater, deserving of being stoned to death. Those familiar with rabbinic or other legal logic might suspect where we're headed. We know about unambiguous cultic action. What about ambiguous cultic action? Indeed, this is the very question that the rabbis ask. To do so, they focus on two actions prohibited in Mishnah Sanhedrin 7:6, bowing and kissing. Already in the Hebrew Bible, bowing to an idol is a clear no-no. It says right there. The second commandment, or in many Christian traditions of counting the first commandment, declares, "You shall not bow down to them." Pretty straightforward, right? That is to other gods. But what about if it only looks like I'm bowing down to them? This question does not escape rabbinic attention. A spring that flows out of a temple of idolatry, one should not bend down in front of it and drink, because it will appear as if one bows to an idol. But one may turn his back to it and drink. And in a place where one is not seen, it is permissible to drink. Imagine you're a good rabbinic Jew living in an ancient Roman city. On your daily comings and goings, you often encounter pagan temples. Some of these temples have water flowing from them. And sometimes you're thirsty. So what do? The answer is not always a clear prohibition, but rather the common rabbinic answer. It depends. Studying rabbinic literature, I always tell my students, your default answer, if I ask you anything, your answer should be, it depends, and then work through it. Very rarely is it yes or no. Except once I said to students, what's the answer to this? And the student said, it depends. And I said, actually, the answer is no. But that's because it depends was still available. Okay, so let's work through the variables. So first of all, intentionally bowing to an idol, clearly forbidden. Second, in general, drinking water from such a source is clearly not forbidden. What is forbidden then is appearing to bow before an idol. So therefore, if you were to lean over to drink directly from the water source, it might appear as if you were bowing to an idol, which would be forbidden. But if you were to turn your back to the idol and then lean over to drink, it would appear that you were drinking, not bowing. You're turning your back, you're making it clear you're not bowing to them, so everyone can see that you're just drinking. And if your act of drinking is not visible to others, so no one else can see it, then you need not even bother turning your back. The problem is about external perception. Once it is clear that your action is not an unambiguous cultic act, that is ambiguous or clearly not an act at all, then it is not deemed idolatrous, hence you can drink. The question of perception rises again with the age-old question, is a kiss just a kiss? Or does it mean something more? To answer this dilemma in regard to idolatry, we turn to our next text. Sculptures of faces that spout water in the cities, one may not place his mouth on the mouth of the sculpture and drink, because it will appear as if one kisses an idol. But one may collect water in his hand and drink. Furthermore, they said, one may not place his mouth on the mouth of a pipe and drink, because of mortal danger. Anyone who's taken a stroll through modern Rome knows that sculptures of faces are a common sight, and like the famous fountain at the entrance of the Orange Garden on the Aventine Hill, there's a picture of it, some of these faces do indeed spout water out of their mouths. So you can see, this is the kind of thing they might see. It might be hard to see, but right here, there's water spouting out of his mouth. And you can go today to the Orange Garden in Rome and drink from it, as long as you follow these rules, right? This fact is perhaps why the text specifies in the cities, as cities are more likely than towns or villages to feature such expensive sculpture. Also, anyone who has taken a stroll through modern Italy knows that walking around in the hot Mediterranean makes you thirsty. But once again, the problem of perception arises. The issue is not in regard to drinking the water in and of itself. I should note that this would not be the case if the sculpture was spouting wine. So spouting wine, there would be a whole other problem that I can talk about in question and answer if you want to know about. Rather, the issue is that if you put your mouth up to the sculpture in order to drink, then it would appear as if you're kissing the sculpture. And, as we have learned, kissing idols is forbidden. But if you were simply to cup your hands and collect the water from the face fountain in them, and then drink from your hands, your actions would be unambiguously non-idolatrous. You would be drinking, not kissing. Furthermore, the text continues, you should not place your mouth up to any pipe and drink, because doing so puts your life at risk. Of course, actual idolatry also puts your life at risk, right, because of the mandatory stoning to death. But the text also has focused not on the dangers of actual idolatry, but on the dangers of perceived idolatry. So here then we turn from fear of appearance of an idolatrous act to actual mortal danger. But what is the mortal danger? According to Bavli Avodah Zarah 12b, the Babylonian Talmud Avodah Zarah 12b, what is the danger? A leech. In this case, perception is not the issue, but rather the fear is of swallowing a leech, which is apparently a critical concern. Later on in the text, they talk all about what happens if you swallow a leech on the Sabbath. That's a whole other discussion we could have. In fact, so dangerous to swallow. I already said that, so I'll skip that. So do not drink from any pipe, lest you swallow a leech and put your life at risk. And do not actually bow to or kiss an idol, lest we need to stone you to death. But if you're thirsty and encounter a spring flowing from an idolatrous temple or from the mouth of an idol, then just make sure that it is abundantly clear that you are neither bowing nor kissing. So long as we know that you're interested in H2O and not X's and O's, then feel free to quench your thirst. From what we've learned about idolatry, now we turn our attention to the next section, which I entitle, What to Do When Your Drunk Friend Pushes You in a River. It's actually hard to find a picture I felt like I could use for this, because when you Google that, lots of things come up, and it's unclear to what extent everyone involved in that was agreed to that being done. And this is for like a comedy spoof of it, so I figured since it was a sketch designed to be filmed, they both had that. But I keep saying that to make sure of it, I need to get some friends together, get them drunk, and then have them push each other into rivers and take pictures of it, just so that I can make sure that all the rules are being followed. So imagine two friends walking along a river. While following the switchbacks of the riverbank, they reminisce about old times. And because this story appears in this talk, they do so while drinking. Eventually, one friend, now very drunk, turns to the other and promptly pushes them into a river. The obvious question to ask is, what are the implications for the rabbinic impurity system? Or at least that's what the rabbis themselves would ask. In fact, that's what the rabbis themselves do ask. If one immersed himself in a river and there was before him another river and he crossed through it, the second river's water purifies the first river's water. If his drunk friend pushes him into a river post-immersion, and likewise his animal, the second river's water purifies the first river's water. But if the drunk friend pushes the person or animal while horsing around, then behold, this is but if water is put upon, from Leviticus 11:38. Right? Straightforward, we all get it. We move on. But this is super technical, but this short Mishnah requires a lengthy explanation. This is a perfect example how drinking leads to discussion of themes in rabbinic literature. To talk about rabbinic ritual impurity, this is a great way to do it. To begin, you have to understand the concept of machshirin, which is the name of this tractate from the Mishnah. Machshirin is from the same Hebrew as the word kosher, which generally means fit or proper or appropriate. But machshirin in this context refers to a status in which an object, often food, is susceptible to, often referred to as prepared for, ritual impurity if it comes into contact with most, but not all liquids. Straightforward, right? It takes a while to understand. More specifically, it refers to the liquids themselves that transmit this ritual impurity. So to understand this concept, imagine a regular wall, just a non-metallic plain wall. Were I to take a magnet and hold it up to that wall, as soon as I let go of the magnet, it would hit the floor. But if I were to paint that wall with magnetic paint, and then to repeat my experiment, the magnet would now stick to the wall. This is what the concept of machshirin gets at. If a substance is not prepared for ritual impurity, then like a magnet on a non-metallic wall, liquid does not transfer impurity. Impurity doesn't stick. This is the stickiness of impurity. Does it stick or not? So if the substance becomes prepared for ritual impurity, it is now susceptible to the transmission of ritual impurity, and much like the non-metallic painted wall, will now attract a magnet. So the tractate Machshirin in general explores the contours of how, like a magnet, impurity either sticks, i.e. transfers from an impure to a pure object, or doesn't stick, doesn't transfer, when it comes into contact with certain liquids. In the rabbinic purity system, liquids are much more problematic than solids. So if you're having trouble grasping this concept, know that you're not alone. The laws related to Machshirin are quite complex, as one ancient student discovered. According to Yerushalmi Shabbat 729c, a rabbinic figure named Yehuda Bar Rabbi spent six months studying the tractate of Machshirin and then promptly flunked a test on the subject, which is really bad most times because you go away, you study things, you come back and you be tested, and then adjust your stipend accordingly. So if you flunked your test, it meant you lost your funding. So bad. When we return to the issue of defining what liquids prepare for ritual impurity, we need to understand the difference between the water from the first river, talk about that, right, and the second river. In the first instance, a person intentionally enters a river in order to bathe. Intentionality is key here, as it is only because that person intended to get into this water and get that water on them that the liquid prepares for ritual impurity. Subsequently, that person crosses another river, that second river. In doing so, that person wades through that second river's waters, but does not get wet intentionally. Rather, they got wet because they needed to cross the river. The water is seen as a side effect, not a desired goal. Unlike the first water, which was intentionally put upon in order to bathe. They went into that water because they wanted that water to get on them. The second water, they went in just because they needed to cross it. It's unintentional, and therefore it does not prepare for ritual impurity. For them, then, that unintentional water washes away that first intentional water, and hence it purifies it. And the person no longer has water upon them that would transfer ritual impurity. It no longer sticks. It's gotten off that sticky water, and they're no longer sticky. This background helps us understand the second case in which a drunk friend pushes either a person or an animal into a second river. While we do not learn whether the person pushed, or the animal for that matter, is drunk, their level of intoxication is not important for the present concern. Rather, what matters is that the person doing the pushing is not sober. Since it is the pusher's intentionality that is concerned, then it is their sobriety that is of concern. We don't care about the pushee because their intentionality doesn't factor in for them. Therefore, because the person or animal pushed into the second river does not enter via an intentional act, the case is deemed as above, and the second river's water purifies. So it's seen as either if they have water on them, it's purified, or that water wasn't intentional, so it doesn't function like a first river. You need an intentional act. A drunk friend pushing you in might not be an intentional act. I said might because if the drunk pusher did so while horsing around, then the second river's water is the same status as the first, so it cannot purify. The reasoning behind this latter case should be familiar to anyone who's seen a group of children or drunk adults acting like children, playing near a pool. Inevitably, one child, or a drunk adult acting like a child, will playfully throw another into the pool. This action is an intentional act. The intentionality defines the action, and as a result, the water put upon the one thrown into the water prepares for it. And I'd like to compare this to your drunk friend saying, "Hey, buddy," and smacking you on the back, and it knocks you over, versus your drunk friend running and going to knock you in, right? The first one was just not paying attention. The second one, there was intentionality to it. In this text, then, water functions much like it does on the pH scale. It is neutral. Only with the introduction of an intentional act does water move from its neutral status to a status in which it can impart impurity. And this takes us to the final issue of this text, the biblical verse. The point of the last verse of this line, in which is from Leviticus 11:38, but if water is put upon appears, is that if the drunk person pushed in their friend or friend's animal in jest, then that constitutes an intentional act, and the water upon the friend or animal would transmit ritual impurity. Here the text presumes its audience possesses knowledge of Leviticus. It is common through rabbinic literature to presume that the readers have memorized the entire Hebrew Bible, and hence to expect a few words to cue the rest of the biblical verse or passage. So it just assumes everyone's memorized the Bible, so it'll stay a few words. In fact, and this is a fun little feature of rabbis, sometimes the rabbis do not even quote the relevant part of the verse. They simply expect the reader will remember the verse and then correctly infer the part that applies to the context at hand. This sometimes happens if people read rabbinic text in translation. They'll read, as it says, and they'll quote, Moses said to Aaron, and then you're like, okay, and what's the why? And it's because they'd assume you know which Moses said to Aaron they meant, and you know the rest of it, and you know how that applies to what they're talking about. So this presumption is why often the text will quote only part of the relevant part, and you have to go back and check the text, unless you've memorized the entire Hebrew Bible, which I admit I have not yet. Leviticus 11:34-38 discusses the various laws related to carcass and liquid impurity. These verses form the basis for the entire rabbinic legislation regarding liquids preparing for the transmission of ritual impurity. The key part of Leviticus 11:38 is, but if water is put upon the seed, skipping a little bit, it is impure for you. The rabbis believed that water had to intentionally come into contact with the person. And further, they believed that the liquids needed to be potable, needed to be drinkable in order to count. Their logic for this criterion is of Leviticus 11:34, which states, and any liquids that may be drunk shall be impure. For the rabbis, God carefully wrote and edited the Hebrew Bible with the intention to instruct. So every word is written by God, according to the rabbis, for a specific educational reason. So, therefore, each word has divinely endorsed interpretive weight. So when Leviticus 11:34 had that clause, that may be drunk, it's instructive. Only drinkable liquids count. So thus they state elsewhere, there are 7 liquids that prepare for ritual impurity. In case you really wanted to know, it's dew, water, wine, oil, blood, milk, and bees' honey. And an additional clarification appears elsewhere. but rather the sages said 7 liquids prepare for ritual impurity, and all other liquids prepare for ritual purity. They're saying only these 7 does this stickiness concept of machshirin apply. The others that doesn't enter into it. So only those 7 named above count, and all other beverages do not, and thus they cannot transmit ritual impurity in regard to the biblical category of but if water is put upon. So now we've been introduced to the complex halakha applicable when our drunk friend pushes us into a river. We segue to the final section, which I entitle Torah Brightens the Face. Midrash is the rabbinic exegetical process through which the complex details of God's commandments are analyzed and comprehended, assuring compliance with halakha. But that does not mean that it has to be drudgery. In fact, for the rabbis, this interpretive activity is more hobby than homework. While interpreting Torah is serious business, it's also serious fun. Lest this audience depart from this talk thinking that this labor of love is more labor than love, we examine a text in which this issue comes to the forefront. Rabbi Yehuda be Rabbi Elai drank the 4 cups of Passover night and bandaged his head until the festival of Shavuot. A certain matron saw him with his face lit up, and she said to him, old man, you're one of 3 things. Either you're a wine drinker, or you're a lender of interest, or you're a pig breeder. He said to her, may that woman's breath expire, i.e. die. I am none of these 3 things. Rather, my learning is within me, for it is written, the wisdom of a person brightens his face. Ecclesiastes 8:1. Our sugya, our rabbinic passage, opens with an instance of excessive drinking. We learn that Rabbi Yehuda Bey, and Bey is a Hebrew term for son of, so Ben, Rabbi Elai drank the 4 cups of wine required for the celebration of Passover. Perhaps unaccustomed to drinking this much wine, he ends up with a headache, which is why he bandaged his head. This is before aspirin, a symptom caused by dehydration likely. But this is not just any headache. This is post-Passover headache, persists for 50 days, the length of time between Passover and Shavuot. Quite the hangover. The detail of Rabbi Yehuda Bey Rabbi Elai drinking wine partly cues the tale that follows. The other association that generates the story is the reference to Shavuot. Shavuot, meaning weeks in Hebrew, also known as Pentecost, meaning 50th in Greek, is a biblical festival that later becomes associated with the divine revelation of Torah at Mount Sinai. Therefore, the festival of Shavuot necessarily gestures towards the importance of Torah and Torah knowledge. The tale that follows proved quite popular in rabbinic literature and appears in several other texts. But in our present version, a certain matron, in Aramaic matrona, which refers to a high-status Roman and hence non-Jewish woman, encounters Rabbi Yehuda Bey Rabbi Elai with his face aglow. She greets him, referring to him as old man, in Aramaic Saba, a term that can also mean Tana, and not coincidentally, Rabbi Yehuda Bey Rabbi Elai is indeed a Tana, which is means he's a member of the earliest group of rabbis, the Tanaim, which resided in Roman Palestine in the 1st to the 3rd century CE. So when she refers to him as old man, that would cue 2 things. One is the way he's just using it, referring to him as old man, but also referring to him as this early authoritative rabbinic figure. So it cues our readers to think of him as someone of a certain stature. Upon gazing at this old man / Tana, the Matrona concludes that his face can only be lit up for one of 3 reasons, and none of them are good. First, because he's a wine drinker. By this, the Roman matron implies that he is a drunkard, a condition of unrestrained alcohol addiction to which both the rabbis and Romans and many other ancients disapprove. Second, because he lends on interest. Acts of usury are strongly condemned in both biblical literature. For example, elsewhere we learn that usurers declare the Torah a fraud and Moses a fool. For they say, if Moses would have known how profitable we would be, he never would have written the prohibition against usury. I love that. Usury is bad because by doing it, they say, if Moses only knew how much money we'd be making, he wouldn't have written that. So we don't have to follow those rules because Moses didn't realize our profit margins. It's a great counter-argument, right? I love that. Or third, because he's a pig breeder. While consuming pig is biblically forbidden, the rabbis extend this taboo even to pig breeding. As they say elsewhere, Jews may not raise pigs anywhere. Whether outside the land of Israel or in its midst, pigs can neither be eaten nor raised by Jews. As I've previously argued elsewhere, you referenced some of the things I've worked on of that, pigs can neither be eaten nor raised by, the pig taboo takes on a special significance in Greek and Roman context, where ancient Greek, Roman, and Jewish authors often point to the practice of pig avoidance as a key signifier of Jewish identity. Further, the practice of pig consumption is strongly invested by both ancient Jewish and Roman sources with Roman identity, the literal ingestion and embodiment of Romanness. Therefore, by avoiding pig eating and pig breeding, the rabbis are rejecting assimilation into the Roman body. Regardless of which scenario implies, whether drunk on wine or excited by the high profit margins and fast cash made by engaging in biblically and rabbinically forbidden business, the Roman matron believes that the rabbi's face is lit up is a sign of his bad life choices. While returning to that text, while Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Elai does not agree that his face positively glows, for him it is a sign of his good life choices. He begins his retort by expressing his desire that the Matrona immediately stop breathing. Following this literal death wish, he denies being any of these three things. Why then is his face aglow? Because my learning is within me. A phrase meaning that his frequent study of Torah has led to a deep knowledge of rabbinic traditions. The biblical proof text reinforces this assertion. We come back to Ecclesiastes, you said we should have thought about it, so there we go. How do we know that besides wine drinking, usury, and pig breeding, Torah can lighten up one's face? Because it's written in Ecclesiastes 8:1 that the wisdom of a person brightens his face. For Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Elai, it is Torah and not wine that brightens his face. Learning Torah is a joy. In the process of this joyous practice, Torah knowledge becomes embodied in those who learn it. The light of Torah then shines through them, illuminating their face. And how do we know this? Because it is written in Ecclesiastes 8:1 that the wisdom of a person brightens his face. Not because they drink wine, but because they sit at the feet of their rabbinic sage, and in the words of Mishnah Avot 1:4, drink their words with thirst. Throughout this talk, I have argued that exploration of rabbinic texts about drinks and drinking can serve to introduce key themes of rabbinic literature. And in some ways, although I won't talk about modern politics, the big debate around a Supreme Court nomination keeps having resonances of working with rabbinic texts about drinking. In a version of this talk I give, there's a rabbinic text that says that someone who drinks too much is invalid to serve as a judge. And it's hard to read that and not see how that can be part of a broader conversation. But I like to say I don't talk about modern politics. I only talk about ancient rabbis who say things that may or may not be applicable to today. I leave that to the congregational rabbis to deal with. So throughout this talk, I've argued that the exploration of rabbinic texts about drinks and drinking can serve as introduction to key themes in rabbinic literature. As I explore further in my book project in progress, beverages appear everywhere, from biblical interpretation to medical opinions. Glasses are raised at weddings and at funerals, at Sabbath feasts and at commonplace meals. Rabbis visit bars and the homes of colleagues, where ordinary and extraordinary events unfold. Wine and beer most often fill the rabbinic cup, but though other beverages, such as water and milk from both human and non-human animals, appear as well. My goal in this talk and in my project in general is not only to introduce rabbinic themes, but to demonstrate the joy encountered in the mental workout of swimming in the sea of Talmud. In short, I aim not only to wet your whistle, that is to satisfy your thirst, but also to whet your appetite, to make you thirsty. At the conclusion of every Talmud tractate in the modern standard printed edition, the following formula appears. There it is in English, and I highlight it at the bottom. It says, "We shall return to you," and it's the name of the last chapter, and the name of that tractate is concluded. After completing the tractate, there's a traditional reciting of a ritual liturgy in Aramaic hadron, which is "we shall return," and there's the Aramaic quote right there, is the first word. And then offering a festival meal known in Hebrew as a siyum, meaning completion. As we might expect, after, in the words of Mishnah Avot 1:4 again, drinking their words with thirst, students not only eat, but drink at these festive occasions. So I invite my audience to partake of this tradition, pour yourself a drink and celebrate, but then sober up and return to learn more. After all, it is not wine, but Torah knowledge that brightens a person's face. Thank you. So I'm supposed to field.
Yes, we have some time for questions, comments.
So in the first example you gave, the building the seed for the pomegranate.
Yes.
I can understand why it's prohibited to not, you can't do labor on the Sabbath, so you can't do it for wine. But
So it's not labor.
what is it, yeah?
So the issue is, they're not exactly sure what the issue is part of the thing. And that's an okay thing. So some people say, well, by setting up the seed, I am building. That is an act of building. And building is one of the 39 prohibited labors. Some say, no, it's not building, it's selecting. By setting it up to pour through that act, I'm selecting, I'm pulling out, like imagine if you're looking at a whole bunch of pieces of wood and you're selecting which one's going to be for a building or not. So they're trying to figure out. And what it comes down to is, basically what you get the feeling is, they don't want it to occur, but they're not exactly sure why it shouldn't. So they're trying to figure out, they have the answer, which is don't do it. They just don't know what the justification for not doing it
But
is.
if the building, you can't build something for doing it for wine because you can't build.
Mhm.
Why can you build it for a pomegranate?
This is why I love the rabbis. The rabbis are incredibly systematic, except when they're not. And for them, if you're building it for straining wine, that's a problem. But if you're setting it up for a pomegranate, that's not a problem.
What are you gonna
One
do?
is building, one is not. And this is if something is in a category or if it's not. And they had decided that setting up a pomegranate holder is not an act of building. Setting up a strainer that looks a lot like a pomegranate holder is. And often an example I give is the parent who has two children and says, don't touch your brother, right? And they go, I'm not touching him, right? They're not touching him, right? But they're touching him, in fact. But they're not. So for them to do that, the building applies if it's a strainer. Building does not apply if it's a pomegranate holder. So, as long as I prove it's a pomegranate holder, I haven't violated anything. Once I pull this pomegranate holder, I can do whatever I want with a pomegranate holder. Because it's a pomegranate holder, it's not a strainer. Now, if I didn't put those pomegranates in, then it's a strainer and I'm violating law. And I agree, the good thing is I often say to my students, have I not answered your question? Right? That tension should be there, and that's why I keep pointing to that. They say it's a subject. They say it's a trick. I know you're saying, like, how could they? They're saying, we get it. But they're also saying, one violates the law, one doesn't. So have I not answered your question? You can still push back, but.
Well, it's like, why does it? I'm still trying to figure out why shouldn't you do it for wine in the first place?
Because that's building or selecting, because you shouldn't.
But it's for pomegranate, okay.
This is, there's that famous Jewish joke about it could lead to dancing.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a lot of rabbinic literature. Right? Because it could lead to straining. That's what I can give you. Yes.
You talked about barley beer,
Yeah.
and it's like, from what I've heard you say, is that the rabbis really don't want people to drink barley beer at all.
No, you can drink barley beer. You can drink barley. There's lots of different beer.
There are so many hoops that you have to go through.
I'm talking about drinking barley beer on intermediate festival days. Only.
Okay.
On other days, now, there's lots of evidence that suggests that they drank lots of different types of beer, and date beer is probably a little bit more popular than barley beer, but I'm talking about that. If we're looking more broadly, there are lots of discussions that barley beer is not a problem. Particularly one rabbi loves to bring this up. His name is Rav Papa, but you learn about Rav Papa is he made a fortune as a microbrewer. So he goes out of his way to continuously be like, oh, beer's not a problem, people. Beer, we're fine. And so, like, you know, this text about wine, and then Rav Papa will pop up and say, oh, not a problem to drink beer, people. In fact, if you don't drink beer, it's a bad thing, right? And it's like, gee, the CEO of Budweiser saying it's okay to drink beer. So yeah, there's plenty of, except when they say no. So, but yes, in general, I would say it's not. It's just in this particular case. That, and then we'll work more with that.
I also want to ask about beer.
Yes.
Is the discussion of beer also in the Jerusalem Talmud or only in the Babylonian?
So the Jerusalem Talmud is written in a Roman context where wine is the beverage of choice. The Jerusalem Talmud speaks almost nothing of beer. There's a little bit, but very little. But a great example for this is if you look at where beer comes up in the Babylonian Talmud, and where Rav Papa jumps in, is if you look at Mishnah in the Jerusalem Talmud, they talk about Kiddush for Friday night, Havdalah for Saturday night. It's all about wine, 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 wine. In the Babylonian Talmud, they say, can we use beer for this? The Palestinian Talmud, they wouldn't ask that because they think wine is the drink. It's in Babylonian Talmud that they begin to ask that question.
I wonder if, I know that the Babylonians were famous beer brewers.
Yes,
I remember that there were hundreds and hundreds of different varieties of beer.
yes.
Also, they fed them, they gave them to the gods. Some of the gods like beer, some like wine. And I wonder whether, as late as the Talmud, they were still using beer for their cooking purposes.
The rabbis choose not to explore that avenue. The rabbis choose to say wine is problematic because, and this starts in Mishnah, the rabbis say that wine is the only beverage libated. So they have all these fears about libations being pouring out as in worship of deity. Everything else they think isn't. So the Babylonian rabbis just don't even go into that. They focus everything on wine, and I think they do that because then they can say wine so bad, beer not a problem. Like there's a wonderful text that again Rav Papa comes up in where they say, okay, so you can't drink wine made by non-Jews. What about beer? And so it says, well, you can't do it, but it says in Hebrew, mishum chatanu, because of intermarriage. So they say, well, one rabbi, he would order beer at a non-Jewish bar and have them bring it to him outside. He stood right outside the bar and said, thank you, you drink it. The idea being, it was be not kosher to drink it in the bar because of the social context. And another rabbi, he was much more strict, so he'd order the beer, bring it, and as soon as he crossed the lintel into his house, then he'd drink it. And it's very clear there that they're saying, look, this isn't wine, and they don't explore that other aspect. Okay, so we'll start on this. Yes.
So, question of subterfuge.
Yes.
First, I want to get one of the Massachusetts and Bexley, because then I'm more interested in the sort of dichotomy in your brain of engaging in subterfuge on purpose, and is that in fact plot? So when the Orthodox put up the strings in their neighborhoods so that they can.
So the eruv, the legal fiction that's a string that makes separate boundaries become a mixture that is a single boundary.
Right. Is that a subterfuge or is that a?
No, that's a legal fiction.
That's
Okay, so that wouldn't be their term. So let me begin it this way. So they will acknowledge on a few occasions that there's something of subterfuge. They'll say, look, we get it that we get that we see what we're doing here. You and I know what we're doing here. But it's technically legal. It's like, I remember when I was a grad student, I did my own taxes because it was all straightforward because I had made no money. And then I got a job and I was like living in different states moving around, so I went to a tax person. And I started to ask questions and they're like, oh, you can do this, you can do, and I was like, wait, that's allowed? I'm like, yeah, it's not problematic at all, right? And these things that to my mind, I'm like, how is that allowed? And they're like, because it's not a problem, and logically I thought it would be. Similar thing for them, it's like, it's not, we know it's a trick, but you can deduct it, you can do it, right? Same thing in there. So you have the subterfuge. Okay, you have that. Now when you're talking about, for them they say, X is not allowed, which would be on the Sabbath, you carrying something from your domain to mine. But there are ways to make it, which the Eruv is, it means mixture, to mix our domains, and so now if we're within that, we are now in a single domain, therefore we have not violated. And so for them it becomes a binary, have you violated, have you not? And within that there's still a playfulness, but for them it's different if they say, well now we've changed the category of it, and they're playful, but not in the winking way for that. What they're doing for that is, that's part of the rabbinic game, is to figure out how, that's, again, the anomalous, how do we make this not? And it gets complicated. In fact, the talk I'm giving tomorrow actually has an example of an odd thing that comes up with when does the laws of Eruv apply or not apply. Does that not
Yeah,
answer
no,
your
it's
question.
interesting that one's sort of a accepted legal fiction, one's a subterfuge, and there's a.
Well, it's a subterfuge that's an accepted subterfuge.
Okay.
It's just, at a certain point, they're like, yeah, we know what we're doing, it's so silly, but yes, it's allowed, right? They're kind of winking and nodding. And the other one, they're embracing it, but they're still playful, but with a little something. Yes.
You piqued my interest on the introduction. I don't know if it's too long a question, but a short answer on the Jews and Chinese food connection?
Very quickly, I'd say, what it comes down to is a few things. One is shared immigration pattern of certain significant amount of Jews and a certain significant amount of Chinese Americans to Lower East Side of Manhattan. Then when you get there, you have the fact that there's cultural baggage with going out and seeing religious iconography in an Italian or an Irish restaurant, where seeing a cross or a Virgin Mary, where seeing a statue of the Buddha is not quite as seen as quite so overt with religious baggage. There's the fact that Chinese food does not feature milk, so there's no mixing of milk and meat in that sense. And the fact that meat tends to be shredded up, and so in an era before people knew exactly what Mushu pork was, people could say, I'm not going to ask what that is, but I'm going to have that white-looking dish in there.
It wasn't like a pork tenderloin.
Right, exactly. And what two scholars refer to it as safe trade. So safe, non-kosher food. The idea being it was transgressing without being transgressive, meaning there could still be a wink and a nod to that. Then there's the fact that many Jews who immigrated to America spoke Yiddish, and therefore their English was very stilted, but English was much closer to their ability to speak than someone who came speaking Cantonese or Mandarin. And someone who speak, and therefore, and you get this. There's a famous scene in Portnoy's Complaint where he says, compared to the Chinese restaurant we went to, my father's English was like Lord Chesterfield's, right? And then it becomes an exotic of the other, right? And it's exotic. Then what comes about is after that first generation, the next generation is just raised going there, and it becomes a Jewish thing to do. And then when you have Jews following patterns of white flight, you then also find Chinese American immigrants who also want to move to the suburbs, realize that if they move to suburbs where there's a Jewish population, they already have a certain amount of population that have been introduced to cuisine when it was still exotic, and therefore you can almost start mapping patterns of immigration to patterns of immigration. So that's a longer thing and a shorter thing. Yes.
So, time for one more question, and then I'd like to invite everyone to continue the conversation over the reception.
Okay, so last question.
Okay, it's this issue of subterfuge.
Yes.
Sort of being among Christians. And, in Christianity, subterfuge makes it worse.
Right.
That in effect, God knows what you're doing, God knows what you're thinking, God knows what you're up to. So how can it be okay if God knows that you're trying to sneak past him?
This is the key. Think back to the very beginning. Like the Blues Brothers, the rabbis are on a mission from God. Oral Torah, this whole rabbinic process, is seen as revealed to Moses and Mount Sinai. So God knew they wouldn't have that trick available. God could have written the Torah to prevent it, or made a way for it not to work within the rabbinic system. But since God did not in there, then God winked at their wink, and therefore their subterfuge is a divinely authorized trick that God allowed them to do. So instead of in the system you're talking about Christianity, would imagine someone tricking God in the sense of God seeing that trick. In the rabbinic system, God made that trick, and God is winking when they catch that. So it was like a parent designing a clever thing and watching their kid catch the clever thing, and I have a 4-year-old and watching already, I don't know if it's a sign of him or me, that he can already outthink me and argue me. And one time I agreed to a few things, and then I realized I had agreed to something that I didn't mean to, but he thought 3 steps ahead of me. And you're kind of like the moment of I want to call you on it, but it was brilliant, right? And so the idea of this being God is God saw you were going to do that and allowed it. So the trick is authorized by God. So, and now I'm happy to talk afterwards, but thank
Okay,
you.
well, thank you again. And invite everyone to join us at the reception and continue the conversations. Sweet.